So, let's talk about King Leopold II of Belgium. Now, this is a man with a deeply divided legacy. On one hand, he's known as the Builder King at home, but on the other, he was a brutal tyrant in Africa. So the real question is, right, how can both of those things be true for the same person? Yeah, just look at this. You've got this stately European monarch, king of the Belgians for 44 years. And then you've got the founder and the sole private owner of something called the Congo Free State. This was his own personal empire, right in the heart of Africa. And that's really the heart of the matter, isn't it? How did one guy get remembered at home as this great modernizer, while at the very same time he's running this absolutely brutal regime of exploitation and terror thousands of miles away? That's the huge paradox we're going to try and unpack here. Okay, so let's start with his reputation in Belgium, because to a lot of his own people, he wasn't a tyrant at all. No, he was known by shall we say, a much more flattering nickname. Take a look at this. This is the Cinquantenaire Arch in Brussels, and it's just one of many grand projects that Leopold commissioned. I mean, he oversaw this massive building program in cities like Brussels, Ostend, and Antwerp. He funded everything: parks, museums, even railway stations. And that is why so many Belgians knew him as the Builder King. And if you just looked at his domestic policies, he seemed pretty progressive for his time. During his 44 years on the throne, Belgium actually passed laws to restrict child labor, they gave workers the right to unionize, and even brought in universal male suffrage. So on the surface, he really looked like a modern, forward-thinking monarch. But, and this is a huge but, this quote right here from a letter to his brother, it just reveals his true obsession: colonies. He believed deep down that for Belgium to be truly great, it absolutely needed an overseas empire. And it was this ambition, this single-minded ambition, that would connect his two legacies in the most brutal way you can imagine. So this ambition, it kind of became his secret project. See, Leopold was relentless about getting a colony, but the Belgian government, they just weren't interested. So he thought, fine, I'll get one for myself. And boy, was he strategic about it, and pretty deceptive too. In 1876, he starts what he calls an International Philanthropic Association. Sounds nice, right? Well, it was a total front. He then hires the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley to go out and stake his claim in the Congo Basin. Then comes the masterstroke. At the Berlin Conference, he somehow convinces all the great powers of Europe and the United States to recognize his control. He promised he'd bring civilization, he'd end the slave trade, and they bought it. By 1885, it was official. The Congo Free State was his, not Belgium's, his personal property. Just to give you a sense of scale here, his new personal empire was 76 times larger than Belgium, the country he was actually king of. Just wrap your head around that for a second. And this cartoon from the time, it just captures the moment perfectly. You've got the European powers all busy carving up Africa for themselves, and they basically just hand over this massive slice of the continent and all its people to one man. Why? Because they believed his intentions were humanitarian. They were so tragically wrong. And this is where the story takes a really dark turn, because the immense fortune that Leopold would pull out of the Congo to build Belgium, it came at an almost unimaginable human cost. Yeah, that whole philanthropic mission, it was a complete lie. The real purpose of the Congo Free State was to make Leopold personally rich, and the methods they used to do it, they were nothing short of barbaric. His main tool for enforcing his will was something called the Force Publique. This was his private army, a mercenary force really, made up of European officers and African soldiers. And their job was to terrorize the Congolese population and force them to work. And this led to the regime's currency of terror. When the global demand for rubber just exploded, Leopold turned the entire Congo into a massive slave labor camp. The Force Publique soldiers were given bullets, but they had to account for every single one. So to prove they hadn't wasted them on, say, hunting, they were required to bring back the severed hand of a person for every bullet they fired. If a village didn't meet its rubber quota, hands were just chopped off as punishment. It was a total, complete system of terror. Men were forced deep into the forests to harvest wild rubber. And to make sure they complied, their wives and children were held hostage, often starved and abused. And if you failed to meet the impossible quotas, well, that meant torture, murder, and the mutilation of men, women, and even children. And this wasn't some judgment we made 100 years later with the benefit of hindsight. No, as early as 1890, an American journalist named George Washington Williams, after he'd actually visited the Congo, used a phrase that still sends a chill down your spine. He called Leopold's regime responsible for crimes against humanity. Now, of course, exact numbers are impossible to verify, but the consensus among historians is just staggering. It's believed that the population of the Congo may have been slashed in half. We're talking an estimated 10 million people dying from the violence, the forced labor, and all the famine and disease that just ripped through the devastated region. But a crime of this magnitude, it couldn't stay hidden forever. And slowly but surely, a few brave individuals began to expose the horrible truth to the rest of the world. And two men were absolutely central to this. First, you have E.D. Morel. He was a British shipping clerk, and he noticed something odd. Ships coming from the Congo were full of valuable rubber and ivory, but the ships going to the Congo, they carried only soldiers and guns. He knew something was terribly wrong, and he went on to found the first major international human rights movement. And he was joined by Roger Casement, a British consul whose official government report confirmed the absolute worst stories of abuse. Then, the cause was picked up by some cultural giants. Joseph Conrad's famous novel, Heart of Darkness, gave the world this haunting, fictionalized look into the sheer madness of it all. And then the great Mark Twain wrote a blistering satire called King Leopold's Soliloquy, where he just brilliantly used the king's own public statements to expose his staggering hypocrisy. But maybe nothing captures the sheer horror more than this letter from a missionary who was actually there, a man named John Harris. He wrote to one of Leopold's agents, and he said he had promised the local people that, from now on, the regime would only kill them if they actually committed a crime. And that was considered an improvement. So the work of these activists and writers and missionaries, it created this huge international outcry that eventually became too big for Leopold and even Belgium to ignore. It forced a real reckoning with his dark legacy. So in 1908, just 1 year before he died, Leopold was finally forced to give up his personal control. But he didn't set the Congo free. Oh no, he sold it to the Belgian government. His private kingdom became the Belgian Congo, and brutal colonial rule would continue for another 50 years. Which brings us back to this final, really difficult question. King Leopold II used the incredible wealth he plundered from the Congo to beautify his own country, leaving behind a legacy of both magnificent architecture and mass graves. So how should history judge a king who built up one nation by literally destroying another? Well, that's a challenge that Belgium and, frankly, the rest of the world are still grappling with to this very day.